Let me just ask first, earlier today, as I mentioned earlier, I had a very good meeting with Mali Speaker Touré, who's obviously the former Prime Minister as well. And we spoke about a number of issues, including, the challenges of the July election. And I wonder if you might just speak to whether or not it can occur in a way that would be free, fair, and inclusive. We also talked about malaria. I chaired a hearing just a few days ago with Admiral Ziemer. We had Mark Dybel, who now is the Executive Director of the Global Fund, who told us that we are at a tipping point with bed nets now. There's a dearth, there's a lack of bed nets, despite the best efforts of the international community, including the United States, and that they are not forever. Once they last 2 to 3 years, they have to be replaced. And when there's a crisis like we've seen in Mali, infectious diseases and parasites are also opportunistic and could gain a foothold. And I wonder, Ms. Limburg especially, if you could speak, you spoke eloquently to the hunger issue, maybe elaborate a bit on what the issues are, the challenges on malaria and other infectious diseases. We also had a hearing just a few days before that with Dr. Frieden, who talked about multi-drug resistance and resistance in general. You talked about the resiliency efforts. Well, resistance is something we're all concerned about when antibiotics fail to do their magic. So if you could speak to those issues, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. First of all, for the July elections, we're working very closely with international partners and certainly with the Malians to do two things. First is support a reconciliation approach. One of the issues is addressing the fact that so many Malians felt disenfranchised and not a part of the overall conversation. We are supporting both that national reconciliation approach as well as support for the mechanics of the election. Clearly, one of the important issues is ensuring that the many refugees and internally displaced people have an opportunity to vote. And UNDP, along with UNHCR, are very much focused on ensuring that there are those kinds of more inclusive registration approaches. There are two parts to the election. One is the presidential, which is scheduled for July 28th, and it is unclear whether the legislative elections will be able to be held then or scheduled for later in the fall. It is critical that Mali have the elections as a means of returning to its democratic roots and taking a pathway forward. On your second question about malaria, this is critical. You're absolutely right in that even as we look at very high malnutrition rates, at the height of the drought, the largest killer of children under 5 in Burkina Faso was malaria. For that reason, as part of the resilience agenda, and it's a little bit like your 3 committees coming together, we have brought together across sectors, our teams in AID, to put together a more comprehensive, focused approach that includes our efforts to combat malaria and our family planning approaches and our food insecurity approaches together so that we're able to address some of the root causes across the sectors and have a more potent and effective approach to, even as we save lives, setting the pathway to development. Infectious diseases are always of concern when you're moving into emergency, and a lot of our efforts, in addition to our health programming, is also on water sanitation. And the final piece is that in addition to bed nets, it's the behavioral change that's so important, which is why you want to package these together.
Was the Brussels conference a success? Please, that's fine.
It was very successful in that it both raised a lot of money, it kept the attention at the top of international, the issue at the top of international attention, and there was a combined agreement among most of the nations there that it was imperative for Mali to return to its democratic roots and to have national reconciliation as key to moving forward. Almost
out of time, but just if you could spend a moment on the State Department-led Sahel initiative charged with detecting and responding to suspicious movement. Has it worked? Are we happy with the coordination? And the other point, just like with these committees coming across lines, I know that the department is looking because there is a split in terms of jurisdiction. Is the coordination much improved, in your opinion? And what might we expect in terms of new initiatives?
Yes, as far as the coordination between not only the interagencies, but also with the governments involved in the Sahel has been very, I think, very cooperative and focused on really clear common agendas and themes. And then one last step going back to the elections in Mali. I think the elections in Mali will be critical to establishing and moving forward on a whole wide range of issues, because by going into the democracy issues, we can address the other issues. In other words, release our funding and assistance, which has been held up by the sanctions of 7008. But more important is that it's part of the linchpin of the other crises that we must address, which is the humanitarian crisis, the reconciliation in the north, and also the conflict with the extremists.
Ms. Bass.